Well, we're in week 2 of a 4-week series on the covenants called This is the Way. And before we jump into the second episode, I want to tell you why this series matters so much. See, you have people in your neighborhood, in your school, in your community who are angry with God. And the primary reason they're angry with God really has nothing to do with God. The reason they're angry with God is because they're angry with someone who believes in God. At some point along the way, right, a Christian said something hurtful or judgmental or downright crazy to that person, and it hurt them so bad that they closed off their heart to Jesus all together. And the reason that Christian said those things to them is because they didn't have a clear understanding of the covenants. Like, if you don't clearly understand what Jesus came to accomplish and what that means for us, you might wind up using the Bible to bash people into unbelief. There's a whole lot of stuff in the Bible that wasn't written for you, and it wasn't written for me, and it wasn't written for your cousin Sally or your neighbor down the street. It was written for the Israelites who were operating under the old covenant. And it's so important that you understand that so you can represent Jesus well in a culture where so many people have been hurt by Christians. When you truly understand and believe in the way, you'll know what to do, what to think, what to say. And so last week we launched this series by talking about the old covenant, or as we like to call it, the gray, because old. And a lot of it was about rules, right? There was blood sacrificing going on. It was God's people against the world. I mean, it was rough times, honestly. A lot of what happened in the old covenant doesn't mesh very well with our culture today. But that's okay, because that covenant, that agreement between God and man wasn't built for 2020. It was built for and tailored to that era, in that way of life, in that period of human history back then. All right, honestly, bro, I think you should say that again, because they need to catch that. That was good. You think so? That covenant, that agreement between God and man wasn't built for 2020. It was built for and tailored to that era, in that way of life, in that period of human history back then. That was the gray. And this what we're diving into today, this is the way. So about 1,500 years after the establishment of the Old Covenant, Jesus arrives onto the scene. Whether you've been in church for a while or not, you probably know a little bit about Jesus' life on earth once he started his ministry, right? I mean, you've got miracles, sermons, kindness, love, perfection. Well, the night comes for Jesus to die on the cross, and a few hours before he gets arrested, Jesus is sitting down with his disciples for one last meal. We call it the Last Supper. Now, his disciples don't know that this is Jesus' last meal before being killed, but he knows it. And here's what happens in Luke 22:7. Now the festival of unleavened bread arrived when the Passover lamb is sacrificed.
Hold up.
Wait, Passover meal? Doesn't that sound familiar? We talked about the Passover last week, right? The Passover was the night where God saved the Israelites through the shedding of the blood of a perfect lamb. The night of this Last Supper was Passover, when the disciples and really every Jew in the world was reflecting on Moses and freedom from Egypt and the blood of the lamb. Passover was a big deal, and it had been celebrated every year by every Jew on this night for 1,500 years. Keep that in mind as we skip down to verse 19. He took some bread and gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." So do you see what Jesus just did there? He just told all of his Jewish disciples that the Passover meal was going to be all about him from now on. Now, the disciples liked Jesus a lot. They knew something special was going on with Jesus, but nobody messes with the Passover. Like, only a crazy person would take a long-standing religious tradition like the Passover and say, no, the whole Egypt thing with Moses, that was cool, but forget about all of that. From now on, remember me. But like most of us, the disciples didn't immediately catch it. So Jesus continued, and this time he got really specific. After supper, he took another cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." So you see how specific Jesus gets here, right? I mean, he essentially says to his culturally Jewish disciples, steeped in the tradition of Passover since they were babies, since they were born, they had been celebrating this thing. And Jesus says to them, all right, y'all remember how your ancestors spilled the blood of a lamb on the doorpost, right, of a house so that God's judgment would pass over them? Well, my blood is about to be spilled so that God's judgment will pass over you. So when you celebrate Passover, from now on, you're celebrating me. You're not celebrating Moses and me, you're just celebrating me, because as of tonight, I am launching a new covenant between God and mankind. A new agreement, a new way, and it's not an addition to the old way, it's a redirection from the old way. All right, yo, think of it this way. When the pandemic hit, we all experienced what it's like to have to do things in a new way. Right before COVID, you used to sit in a physical classroom, accumulate way too much junk in your locker, and go to soccer practice or softball practice or music rehearsals after school ended. But once this virus became a very real thing in our country, we all had to adjust to a new way. So awkward questions like, how long is too long to hug my crush goodbye? Were no longer a thing. Don't hug anyone unless they live with you. This is a new way. I wonder if I can glance down at my phone screen without my teacher noticing. No, forget about all of that. Okay, you're communicating with your teacher through a screen anyway, and they won't know whether or not you're on your phone because your screen is supposed to be dark. I wonder if I can still go to that party and still make it home before curfew. Don't even worry about that. Your whole life is a curfew. This is a new way. It's not new as in new in addition to the old way. It's new as in a redirection from the old way. And maybe for you and me, this doesn't feel like a shocking declaration from Jesus, but his disciples would have been absolutely floored when Jesus introduced this new covenant. I mean, they didn't even fully understand what all of it meant, right? They didn't know that Jesus was officially fulfilling the words that he spoke to Nicodemus a few years earlier when he said, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son," right? His one and only son, and that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. The disciples didn't realize that the way of God was going to be one of grace from now on, right? They didn't understand all of the new covenant, but they knew that whatever Jesus was talking about, it meant that they were going to have to learn to let go of the way they learned to relate to God, and they're going to have to let go of the way they were learned to relate to other people. And even though you don't come from the same background as the disciples, there are a lot of ways that you relate to God, and there are a lot of ways that you relate to other people that you need to let go of if you want to truly follow Jesus. But it's going to require you to pay very close attention to what Jesus said here in Luke 22, and also to what Jesus is going to say in the passage we'll explore next week. But for this week, here's the point. New is not new in addition to. It's new in place of. And so, as we're going to discover over the next few weeks, like there are a lot of instances where you treat Christianity as if the new covenant that Jesus established is new in addition to the old. You try to follow the way and you also try to follow the gray all at the same time. But that's not what Jesus wanted for his disciples back then, and it's not what he wants for you now. In fact, I'm willing to bet that that's not what you want for you either. Because and we'll talk more about this next week, but whereas the gray was complicated, the way is simple. But we'll get to that next week. See you later.